The data from last year's census was released this week and shows a country in the midst of its own change. In the words of the Bureau of Statistics, a richly diverse society has been recorded in the census. It's shown more than a quarter of the population was born overseas. The United Kingdom is the leading country of birth, followed by New Zealand, China and India. While the numbers are still relatively small, migration from India doubled since the last census. Relations between India and Australia have been strained in recent years by attacks on Indian students. But India, alongside China, is one of the rising Asian giants, a huge population and a fast-growing economy. So how are the diplomatic and trade relations with India? Is Australia making the most of them? And how could the increasing people-to-people links help? I'm joined now by the Trade Minister, Craig Emerson. Craig, welcome to Capitol Hill.
Thanks, Linda.
The Lowy Institute had an Australian-India roundtable last year and introduced it by saying in some ways the ties between these two democracies have continued to fall short of their great potential. Is that a valid statement?
I think it is. India is a very significant part of the reason that we launched the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper project. Sure, China is at the epicentre of that, but other countries such as Indonesia, the other ASEAN countries, Korea, Japan, but very much in our mind is India, because it's got a population of 1.2 billion people, growing very strongly, has done so since the then Finance Minister and now Prime Minister Manmohan Singh began the market opening process back in 1991. So they've been a little bit behind the China market opening process, but they're getting similar results in terms of their growth rates.
We are two nations with historical links, British colonial heritage, both democracies, the obvious sporting links with cricket.
Similar legal systems too.
Similar legal systems. Indian students coming to Australia for education. India's, as I said, experiencing astounding change in its economy. It's now one of the top 5 economies in the world. But in a way, while you say India's part of the reason you launched the white paper, it doesn't seem to be talked about in the same way as China is. Is there not enough public focus on the potential with India?
I think that's a legitimate point to make. It's a giant economy growing strongly, has all of the attributes that you've mentioned. The government of India and the government of Australia have launched negotiations for a comprehensive economic partnership agreement that goes beyond just buying and selling commodities. Our actual trade with India, although it is the 4th biggest export market, is dominated by iron ore, coal and gold. And we want to diversify, particularly into services, which is an area where India has been putting a lot of emphasis. Everyone knows the IT capacity of India. So there are great opportunities here. In fact, we've also established a CEOs forum headed by Lindsay Fox with the CEOs of 4 of our biggest companies interacting directly with the CEOs of Indian companies to identify the blockages on the commercial relationship, but it goes a lot further. The education relationship that you mentioned earlier, the sporting ties. I went to India back in 1978 and they're all going, Bobby Simpson, Bobby Simpson. Didn't know a lot of English, but they certainly knew how to talk about Bobby Simpson, and Brett Lee is a great ambassador, as are some of the other cricketers to our two countries through the work they do in India.
The number of ministerial visits between the two countries has increased a lot, but prime ministerial visits are still pretty rare. There's a lot of focus when prime ministers go to China and Japan and Indonesia. They're seen as important things. Does that high-level diplomatic engagement count too?
I think it does, notwithstanding the fact that India is opening up its economy to the rest of the world and therefore interacting with the rest of the world quite strongly. Much of its growth remains domestic oriented, and something like 42% of Indian children are malnourished or are stunted in their growth. And Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, is very much focused on how to lift so many hundreds of millions of Indians out of poverty who have not yet benefited properly from the growth. Many hundreds of millions have been lifted out of poverty, but we can kind of understand that this is a very big pressing social issue from a man who's committed to doing everything he can. Our argument is trade does that, because through trade there are more jobs. We are, through our relations in the region, trying to open up up markets for pretty poor Indians to produce goods for export markets rather than just the domestic market.
Because, of course, the two Prime Ministers would see each other at regional fora, things like the G20 and APEC. But it's those Prime Ministerial visits which really do put a public focus on the relations, isn't it?
Yeah, it's both a public focus, but it also, interestingly, ensures that ministers and public servants drive towards that particular date of Prime Ministerial visits. So other kind of policy initiatives that otherwise might take a lot longer, through our experience, tend to get truncated because everyone's working towards a deadline. And I think that itself is a bit of an understated benefit from Prime Ministerial visits.
If we could look at the complete opposite side of the equation, that's the people-to-people links. As I mentioned, the growth in numbers of Indian-born Australians, while the numbers are small, the growth is quite big.
300,000 are doubling, as you said in your introduction. So they're now the fourth largest source of overseas-born, people in Australia, and they've overtaken Italy. And I think, there are many people who think, there's a lot of Italians in Australia, or people of Italian ethnic origin. Well, India's the coming change there.
Given that as part of, when you look at a relationship with a country, there's diplomatic links and strategic links and trade links. People-to-people links is always part of that. Is there a way to leverage the people-to-people links that come from a growing Indian-born population in Australia to help with the other engagement with India?
Our view is this, that all of those people who are of Indian ethnic origin, who are in Australia, who have good experiences, the overwhelming majority do communicate back to India, and instead of having one Australian High Commissioner to India, we have hundreds of thousands of ambassadors to India, talking about their great experiences in Australia. So that brings highly valuable cultural links, but also more jobs for both countries through trade and investment. I think what's not widely appreciated is that India has quite large investable surpluses. They have families who are billionaires, and they're looking for places to invest their money. When I was in India last year, I met these young guys, very young fellows associated with the stock market. They said, "Would you like to come to the World Cup?" I said, in cricket. I said, "I don't think I can." And I said, what capacity do you have anyway? And they actually owned the IPL franchises. These guys that seem to be in their 30s and 40s, they were billionaires. And they look to Australia as a place to invest because they see us plugged in the region, they see the region growing and Australia growing, and they think that Australia is in effect like a good proxy for investing in the wider Asian region. So that's something we should be encouraging.
And there are people-to-people links through those sorts of services industries.
Absolutely.
Like education. Yeah. Is that potentially where some of the growth in services can come from?
Oh, sure, education, but don't forget tourism. Just as in China, there's a very strongly growing middle class in India, and they want really good, high-quality tourist experiences. Indian tourists tend to stay an exceptionally long time when they come to Australia. So they obviously come with a lot of money, and they're prepared to spend it on high-quality experiences. And I think that's what needs to happen. Increasingly, Martin Ferguson's saying the same thing with our tourism industry. Effectively, we've got to go upmarket. And sure, that might mean that backpackers find things pretty expensive, but there's lots of things to do in Australia that don't involve staying in five-star hotels. But certainly Indian tourists, Chinese tourists are looking for five-star experiences. What
are some of the roadblocks that still exist in improving the relations between the two countries?
Well, I think with India, nothing happens really quickly, and that's not meant as a criticism, it's just the way it is. It was the same thing with China in the mid-1980s. You need to invest not just money, but invest time in these relationships and get some of the regulatory burdens removed. We have now 3 rounds of negotiation with this comprehensive economic partnership agreement, but it'll be very much informed by this CEO's forum headed by Lindsay Fox, with people like Sam Walsh from Rio and Peter Coleman and also the head of BlueScope. So what they're doing is looking at the impediments to greater trade and investment between those two countries and that informs our negotiations.
As I mentioned before, India is part of multilateral groupings like APEC and the G20.
They're not in APEC, actually.
What sort of role does India play in the World Trade negotiations, which you're very familiar with?
Yeah, I am. Well, India's an important player, like a vital player. What's changed over the last 10 years, Lyndall, is that when the negotiations for the so-called Doha round of multilateral trade liberalisation started back in 2001, India, China, Brazil and countries like that were regarded as developing countries. 10 years later, they're regarded as emerging countries, which is different because they're very big, they're growing strongly, and they are overtaking conventional countries up the ladder of the biggest economies in the world. So what's changed is that the dynamic where countries like the US say, well, hold on, you're not, a poor country anymore as such. We want you to do more in terms of market opening. So that's why I think in part with the emerging countries, they're still looking back at the original mandate and say, well, we're developing countries. The US and the EU saying, well, no, you're emerging countries. Things have changed over this period, and that's what's led to the impasse.
So they're yet to be convinced they should open their markets as much as developed countries think they should.
They have done a lot unilaterally. India has actually been reducing its tariffs not as an obligation, not always as an obligation under the World Trade Organization rules, but just think it's the right thing to do. What we're urging is more is better and quicker is better. So that's always been Australia's position. But that has led to this impasse, the transition, if you like, from countries like India and China and Brazil from developing countries to emerging countries, and that's why Prime Minister Gillard said, right, let's break the roundup into its constituent parts and bring them home as they're ready. And that's actually going quite well in Geneva.
Is that something that's working with the emerging economies, breaking it down into bits that are easier to deal with?
I think it's fair to say that there's some reluctance on the part of the emerging economies, or some of them, but it's going okay. Like their thinking is starting to change as well. For example, just the other day in Mexico, our Prime Minister pushed for the completion of trade negotiations in the group called Trade Facilitation, which is really simplifying customs procedures, streamlining them. There was, on the part of a couple of the emerging countries, a desire that that still be linked to other negotiations. We pushed hard that there be no such linkage, and that was accepted.
I won't ask you when Doha will be successfully concluded.
Well, my hair is still kind of more brown than grey, but I think it would be fairly grey by the time the final negotiation was done. But that's not going to stop us bringing home important negotiations such as trade facilitation. 44% of the whole benefits of the Doha round are in that one negotiation alone.
Craig Emerson, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndall.